You're done here, Marcus. Pack your things and get out. This company has no room for dinosaurs who can't keep up with modern business. Those words echoed in my head as I sat in my empty office at 7 p.m., watching my colleagues avoid eye contact through the glass partition. 28 years of dedicated service to Pinnacle Financial Solutions, and this is how it ended. What my arrogant boss, Trevor Blackwood, didn't know was that hidden in my locked filing cabinet were documents that would destroy not just his career, but the entire corrupt empire he'd built on the backs of innocent investors. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I should have seen it coming the moment Trevor strutted into our Boston headquarters 18 months ago, fresh from his MBA program at Wharton, wearing suits that cost more than most people's monthly salary. At 32, he carried himself with the insufferable confidence of someone who believed his youth automatically made him superior to everyone who'd been grinding in the financial industry since before he was born. My name is Marcus Chen, and at 58, I'd worked my way up from junior analyst to senior portfolio manager through pure determination and an unwavering commitment to our clients' financial security. When I started at Pinnacle in 1996, the company actually lived up to its name. We were ethical, transparent, and genuinely focused on building wealth for the middle-class families who trusted us with their retirement savings. Trevor arrived as Director of Investment Strategy, a position created specifically for him by his mentor, CEO Richard Steinberg. The writing was on the wall from day one. Steinberg had been looking for someone to modernize our approach, someone who could maximize profits in ways that my generation apparently couldn't comprehend. The first red flag came during Trevor's inaugural team meeting. I sat in the conference room alongside my colleagues, watching this kid with perfectly styled blonde hair and dead shark eyes outline his vision for Pinnacle's future. He used buzzwords like aggressive growth strategies and risk optimization protocols while clicking through PowerPoint slides filled with charts that looked impressive but made no mathematical sense. "The problem with this company," Trevor announced, his gaze settling on me with obvious disdain, "is that we've been playing it too safe. Our clients don't want conservative returns anymore. They want growth, and they're willing to accept higher risk to get it." I raised my hand, something that, in hindsight, probably sealed my fate. "Trevor, our client base consists primarily of teachers, firefighters, and small business owners saving for retirement. These aren't day traders looking for quick profits. They need stability and consistent long-term growth." Trevor's smile could have frozen hell. "Marcus, I appreciate your old-school perspective, but the financial landscape has evolved. Clients who want guaranteed returns can stick their money in savings accounts earning 0.5%. We're here to create wealth, not babysit conservative portfolios." The room fell silent. Several younger analysts nodded approvingly, clearly sensing which way the wind was blowing. My longtime colleague, Patricia Hoffman, who'd been with the company almost as long as I had, shot me a warning look that said, "Don't make yourself a target." Too late for that. Over the following months, I watched Trevor systematically dismantle everything that had made Pinnacle Financial a trustworthy institution. He restructured client portfolios to include high-risk derivatives and speculative investments that generated massive commissions for the company while exposing our clients to potentially devastating losses. The beauty of Trevor's scheme was its complexity. Most clients wouldn't understand the technical details of what he was doing to their money. They'd see quarterly statements showing impressive short-term gains and assume their trusted financial advisors were working miracles. What they didn't realize was that Trevor was essentially gambling with their life savings, using sophisticated financial instruments to create the illusion of safe, profitable investing. I tried raising concerns through proper channels. I scheduled meetings with department heads, submitted formal reports questioning the risk levels of our new investment strategies, and even requested a private audience with CEO Steinberg. Every attempt was either ignored, dismissed, or resulted in subtle retaliation. My office assignments became less desirable. My input was excluded from important client meetings. When annual performance reviews came around, Trevor rated my work as adequate but lacking innovation. For someone who'd received outstanding evaluations for over 2 decades, this felt like professional assassination. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday morning in October. I arrived at the office to find Trevor standing beside my desk with 2 security guards and HR Director Jennifer Walsh. His expression radiated the kind of satisfaction that comes from finally eliminating an obstacle. "Marcus, we need to discuss some performance concerns that have been brought to management's attention." I set down my coffee and briefcase, noting how my younger colleagues suddenly found their computer screens fascinating. "What kind of performance concerns?" Trevor stepped forward, clearly relishing this moment. "Your resistance to implementing approved investment strategies has become disruptive to team morale and company objectives. Additionally, several clients have expressed dissatisfaction with your conservative approach to portfolio management." This was complete fabrication. My client satisfaction scores had remained consistently high, and I'd never received a single formal complaint about my investment strategies. But Trevor held all the cards now, and we both knew it. "I'd like to see documentation of these client complaints," I said calmly. "That information is confidential," Jennifer replied quickly. "What's important is that we've decided to restructure your position. Effective immediately, your employment with Pinnacle Financial Solutions is terminated." The words hit like a physical blow. 28 years of building relationships, developing expertise, and maintaining an impeccable reputation destroyed in a single sentence by someone who'd been with the company less than 2 years. "This is age discrimination," I stated, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. Trevor's laugh was genuinely amused. "Age discrimination? Marcus, this is about competence and adaptability. The financial industry has evolved, and unfortunately, some people refuse to evolve with it."
You're stuck in the past, clinging to outdated methodologies that don't serve our clients' best interests. Outdated methodologies like protecting people's retirement savings? Outdated methodologies like being afraid to take calculated risks that could significantly increase their wealth, Trevor shot back. "Your problem, Marcus, is that you lack vision. You see danger where innovative minds see opportunity." The security guards remained silent but alert, ready to escort me out if this conversation escalated. Jennifer clutched her folder of termination paperwork, probably hoping I'd accept defeat gracefully and disappear without causing a scene. Instead, I looked directly at Trevor and spoke words that would prove prophetic. "You're making a mistake, a very serious mistake." His confident smirk never wavered. "The only mistake was keeping you around this long. Pack your personal items. Security will escort you out in 30 minutes. As I cleaned out my desk drawers, removing photographs of my late wife Elena and certificates of professional achievement, I felt the eyes of my former colleagues watching me like spectators at a public execution. Some looked sympathetic but kept their distance, probably terrified that association with me might mark them for similar treatment. Patricia Hoffman approached cautiously as I packed my briefcase. "Marcus, I'm so sorry. This is completely unfair." I glanced around to make sure Trevor wasn't within earshot. "Patricia, be very careful. Document everything you can about the new investment protocols. I have a feeling this company is heading towards serious trouble." She nodded nervously, understanding the implication without needing explicit details. The security guards flanked me as I walked through the office for the last time, past the conference room where I'd attended thousands of meetings, past the coffee station where I'd shared morning conversations with colleagues who'd become friends, past the reception desk where Eleanor Martinez had greeted me cheerfully every morning for 15 years. Eleanor looked up as we passed, her eyes filled with tears she couldn't shed without jeopardizing her own position. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Chen," she whispered. The elevator ride to the parking garage felt endless. One of the security guards, a middle-aged man named Frank who'd worked building security for years, broke protocol to speak quietly. "Mr. Chen, for what it's worth, everyone knows this is wrong. That kid's been gunning for you since day one." I appreciated his kindness, But it didn't change the reality of my situation. At 58, I was unemployed in an industry that worshipped youth and innovation over experience and integrity. My reputation had been systematically destroyed by someone who viewed my ethical standards as obstacles to profit maximization. The drive home to my modest apartment in Cambridge felt like traveling through a foreign country. Everything looked the same, but my entire identity had been stripped away in 30 minutes. I'd defined myself through my work for nearly 3 decades, and now that work was gone, taken by someone who'd barely been alive when I started my career. My apartment felt smaller and quieter than usual. Elena's photograph smiled at me from the mantel, taken during our vacation to Ireland just months before cancer stole from me 3 years ago. She'd been my anchor, my voice of reason, my reminder that work was important but not everything. "What would you do, sweetheart?" I asked her picture. But Elena wasn't there to answer. I poured myself 2 fingers of the Irish whiskey she'd loved and sat in my leather recliner trying to process what had just happened and figure out my next move. At my age, finding comparable employment would be nearly impossible. Ageism in the financial industry wasn't subtle. Companies wanted young, hungry analysts who'd work 80-hour weeks for modest salaries, not experienced professionals who expected fair compensation and reasonable boundaries. My pension from Pinnacle would provide basic security, but it wouldn't replace the salary I'd been earning or maintain the lifestyle Elena and I had worked so hard to build. More importantly, it wouldn't address the burning injustice of being discarded like obsolete equipment by someone who couldn't distinguish between innovation and recklessness. As I sat there drowning in anger and self-pity, my eyes fell on the briefcase I'd carried out of Pinnacle. Inside were the usual items: business cards, pens, a calculator, legal pads filled with meeting notes. But tucked into the side pocket was something Trevor Blackwood definitely didn't know I possessed. A flash drive containing copies of every suspicious document I'd encountered during his 18-month reign of terror. You see, my generation didn't grow up with computers, but we learned to adapt. More importantly, we learned to cover our tracks. While Trevor and his young allies assumed that older employees were technologically illiterate, I'd been quietly documenting every questionable decision, every ethical violation, every piece of evidence that demonstrated how Pinnacle Financial was systematically frauding its clients. I'd started collecting information almost immediately after Trevor's arrival, initially just to protect myself from potential liability. As a senior portfolio manager, I could be held personally responsible if clients lost money due to unsuitable investment recommendations. So I began keeping detailed records of every strategy meeting, every policy change, every directive that contradicted established fiduciary principles. What I discovered was far worse than simple aggressive investing. Trevor hadn't just been taking calculated risks with client money. He'd been engaging in practices that bordered on securities fraud, manipulating portfolio allocations to maximize commissions while concealing the true risk levels from investors. The flash drive contained email chains discussing how to present high-risk investments as moderate-risk opportunities. It held spreadsheets showing the dramatic difference between actual portfolio risk levels and the risk ratings communicated to clients. Most damaging of all, it contained recordings of several strategy meetings where Trevor explicitly instructed analysts to prioritize commission generation over client suitability. I'd been wearing a small digital recorder to meetings for months, initially just to help me remember complex discussions. When Trevor started making statements that clearly violated securities regulations, I made sure to capture every word. Massachusetts is a one-party consent state, meaning I could legally record conversations as long as I was a participant.
The evidence was comprehensive, damning, and potentially worth millions of dollars in whistleblower rewards if reported to the Securities and Exchange Commission. More importantly, It could protect thousands of innocent investors from losing their life savings to Trevor's greed-driven schemes. But first, I needed to understand exactly how deep this corruption went and gather additional evidence that would make my case bulletproof. The SEC doesn't take whistleblower complaints lightly, but they also don't act on incomplete information. If I was going to destroy Trevor Blackwood and the corrupt culture he'd created at Pinnacle Financial, I needed to do it right. I spent the weekend organizing my evidence and researching SEC whistleblower procedures. The process was more complex than I'd expected, requiring detailed documentation, sworn statements, and usually months or years of investigation before any action was taken. This wasn't going to be a quick vindication. It would be a long, methodical campaign that would require patience, strategy, and absolute commitment to seeing it through. Monday morning arrived with the strange sensation of having nowhere to go. For 28 years, Monday had meant putting on a suit, driving to downtown Boston, and starting another week of client meetings and portfolio reviews. Now it meant sitting in my apartment, drinking coffee, and figuring out how to rebuild my life from scratch. I was contemplating whether to start job hunting when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Patricia Hoffman's number. "Marcus, thank God you answered. We need to talk, but not over the phone. Can you meet me for lunch?" An hour later, I sat across from Patricia in a small cafe near Harvard Square, far enough from Pinnacle's offices to avoid unwanted attention. She looked exhausted, older than her 53 years, with stress lines I didn't remember seeing before my termination. "It's gotten worse since you left," she began without preamble. "Trevor's completely lost whatever restraint he had while you were there to challenge him. He's pushing investment strategies that are absolutely insane." "What kind of strategies?" Patricia glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "He's putting retirees into cryptocurrency derivatives and leveraged foreign exchange positions. Last week, he convinced a 70-year-old widow to move her entire portfolio into something called emerging market volatility funds. When I questioned the suitability, he told me that conservative thinking was exactly what was holding the company back." My stomach dropped. "Patricia, those are essentially gambling instruments. They're completely inappropriate for retirement accounts." "I know that, and you know that, but Trevor has convinced Steinberg that this is the future of wealth management. Client accounts are showing huge short-term gains, so nobody's asking questions about the risk levels." This was exactly what I'd feared. Trevor was creating a bubble of artificial success that would inevitably burst, leaving clients financially devastated when market conditions changed. In the meantime, Pinnacle was collecting enormous commissions from these high-risk, high-fee investments. "There's something else," Patricia continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I think Trevor has been backdating some client authorizations. I've seen documents that show investment changes supposedly approved by clients on dates when those clients weren't even in the office." Backdating client authorizations was securities fraud, plain and simple. If Trevor was forging client consent for unsuitable investments, he wasn't just risking their money, he was stealing it. "Patricia, you need to document everything you can. Take pictures, make copies, record conversations if possible. This is criminal behavior, and someone needs to stop it before innocent people lose everything." She nodded grimly. "I've been keeping records, but I'm terrified of getting caught. Trevor's paranoid about loyalty now. He's been calling individual meetings with everyone to make sure we're all committed to the new direction." "Have you had your meeting yet?" "This afternoon. Marcus, I don't know what to say to him. If I express doubts, I'll probably be fired like you were. But if I pretend to support what he's doing, I become complicit in fraud." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Tell him what he wants to hear for now. Keep your job, keep documenting everything, and wait for the right moment to act. This can't continue indefinitely. Trevor's too arrogant and reckless to cover his tracks permanently." What I didn't tell Patricia was that I'd already decided to be the one who brought Trevor down. The evidence I'd collected was substantial, but more importantly, I had nothing left to lose. My career at Pinnacle was over regardless. I could afford to take risks that someone still employed couldn't. After lunch, I drove to the Boston Public Library and spent the afternoon researching securities law and SEC enforcement procedures. The more I learned, the more confident I became that Trevor's actions constituted clear violations of federal regulations. The challenge would be presenting evidence in a way that would prompt immediate investigation rather than bureaucratic delay. That evening, I began organizing my evidence into a comprehensive report. Each email, each recording, each suspicious document was cataloged and cross-referenced with specific securities regulations. I created timelines showing the progression of increasingly risky investment strategies and calculated the total amount of money that had been placed in unsuitable investments. The numbers were staggering. In 18 months, Trevor had shifted over $40 million from conservative investments into high-risk instruments that generated enormous commissions for Pinnacle while exposing clients to potential losses that could wipe out decades of retirement savings.
As I worked late into the night, organizing evidence and crafting my whistleblower complaint, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Alina's death, a sense of purpose that transcended personal interests. This wasn't just about getting revenge on Trevor for destroying my career. It was about protecting innocent people from financial predators who viewed their trust as an opportunity for exploitation. The irony wasn't lost on me. Trevor had fired me because he considered my ethical standards an obstacle to profit maximization. Now, those same ethical standards would be the instrument of his destruction. He'd made a fundamental miscalculation by assuming that eliminating me from Pinnacle would eliminate the threat I represented to his corrupt empire. Instead, he'd simply freed me from any obligation to protect the company's reputation or consider the impact of my actions on my colleagues. I was no longer a Pinnacle employee, bound by loyalty or self-interest. I was a private citizen with evidence of securities fraud and a legal obligation to report it to federal authorities. Over the next week, I refined my whistleblower complaint and prepared supporting documentation. The SEC's whistleblower program offers financial rewards to individuals who provide information leading to successful enforcement actions, but that wasn't my primary motivation. I wanted Trevor's schemes exposed, his victims compensated, and his ability to harm others permanently eliminated. Patricia and I met twice more, each time in different locations to avoid establishing patterns that might attract attention. "He's completely out of control," she reported during our third meeting. "Yesterday, he yelled at Jennifer Walsh for questioning a client authorization that looked suspicious. He told her that questioning his decisions showed a lack of trust in his expertise." Has anyone else started expressing concerns? Quietly, yes, but publicly, everyone's terrified. Trevor's made it clear that dissent isn't tolerated, and with the job market being what it is, nobody wants to risk their livelihood. This was exactly the toxic culture that allowed financial fraud to flourish. Employees who recognized wrongdoing were silenced by fear, while executives who should have been providing oversight chose to ignore red flags rather than confront uncomfortable truths. Patricia, I need you to be extra careful. Don't take any unnecessary risks gathering information. What I have is probably sufficient to trigger an investigation. 2 weeks after my termination, I submitted my whistleblower complaint to the SEC's Boston office. The package included 43 pages of documentation, dozens of email exhibits, transcripts of recorded conversations, and a detailed analysis of how Trevor's investment strategies violated multiple securities regulations. The confirmation email I received indicated that my complaint had been assigned case number WB2024-1247 and would be reviewed by the Enforcement Division within 60 days. 60 days seemed like an eternity when I considered how much additional damage Trevor could inflict during that time, but federal investigations moved at their own pace. While waiting for the SEC to act, I began the depressing process of job hunting. My industry contacts were sympathetic but realistic about my prospects. Most financial firms weren't hiring experienced professionals, and those that were typically wanted candidates who could bring substantial client assets with them. I had several interviews that went nowhere, largely because I couldn't explain my departure from Pinnacle without discussing the circumstances that led to my termination. Saying I'd been fired for philosophical differences with new management sounded like corporate speak for incompetence or difficult personality. The psychological impact of unemployment was harder than I'd anticipated. Elena had always been my emotional anchor during challenging times, and her absence made every setback feel amplified. I found myself talking to her photograph more frequently, seeking advice from someone who couldn't answer, but whose imagined responses still provided comfort. "I know you'd tell me to be patient," I said to her picture one particularly difficult morning. "You'd remind me that good things come to people who do the right thing for the right reasons. But it's hard, sweetheart. It's really hard to keep faith when everything seems to be falling apart." My savings provided temporary financial security, but they wouldn't last indefinitely. More concerning was the growing sense that my professional identity had been permanently damaged. Trevor's narrative about my obsolescence and inability to adapt was starting to feel like prophecy rather than character assassination. Then Patricia called with news that changed everything. "Marcus, something terrible has happened. Mrs. Rodriguez, the 70-year-old client Trevor put into those emerging market funds, she lost 80% of her retirement savings when the Turkish currency collapsed. She's been calling the office crying, saying she doesn't understand what happened to her money." Maria Rodriguez had been my client for over a decade. She'd trusted me to manage the modest nest egg she'd accumulated working as a school cafeteria supervisor, money that was supposed to fund her retirement in dignity rather than poverty. Trevor had moved her account to his supervision after my termination and immediately restructured her conservative portfolio into speculative investments that no reasonable advisor would recommend for someone her age. How is that possible? Her risk tolerance profile specifically indicated conservative growth objectives. Trevor changed her profile without proper documentation. He claimed she'd requested more aggressive growth during a phone conversation, but there's no recording or written confirmation of that conversation. This was the smoking gun I'd been waiting for. Falsifying client risk assessments to justify unsuitable investments was clear evidence of fraud, not just poor judgment or overly aggressive sales tactics. "Patricia, I need you to document everything you can about Mrs. Rodriguez's account. Copies of the original risk assessment, records of when it was changed, any communications about the investment modifications. This is exactly the kind of evidence that will get federal investigators to act quickly." 3 days later, Patricia handed me a manila envelope in the parking lot of a shopping mall in Medford. Inside were photocopies of Maria Rodriguez's complete account file, including the forged risk assessment documents that Trevor had used to justify moving her retirement savings into currency speculation. The documentation was damning. Trevor had literally checked different boxes on Mrs. Rodriguez's.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rodriguez's risk tolerance questionnaire, changing her stated objectives from capital preservation to aggressive growth without any client signature or authorization. He then used this fraudulent document to justify investments that violated every principle of fiduciary responsibility. I immediately prepared a supplemental filing for the SEC, highlighting Mrs. Rodriguez's case as an example of the systematic fraud occurring at Pinnacle Financial. This wasn't theoretical wrongdoing or regulatory interpretation disputes. This was clear, documentable theft from a vulnerable elderly person who trusted her financial advisor to protect her life savings. The SEC's response was swift and decisive. Within a week of submitting the supplemental evidence, I received a call from senior investigator Jennifer Chang requesting an in-person interview to discuss my allegations. Federal investigators had begun making inquiries at Pinnacle Financial, and my case had been escalated to active enforcement status. The interview took place in the SEC's Boston office, a sterile conference room with fluorescent lighting and government-issued furniture that somehow made the proceedings feel more serious and official. Jennifer Chang was a no-nonsense attorney in her 40s who clearly understood the complexities of securities fraud and appreciated the quality of evidence I'd provided. "Mr. Chen, your documentation is extraordinarily comprehensive. Most whistleblower complaints require months of investigation before we can determine whether violations actually occurred. Your evidence makes it clear that systematic fraud has been taking place at Pinnacle Financial. What happens next? We're opening a formal investigation with subpoena power. Pinnacle's executives will be required to produce all documents related to the investment strategies and client authorizations you've identified. We'll also be interviewing current and former employees to corroborate your allegations."
This was the moment I'd been working toward since Trevor destroyed my career. Federal investigators were finally taking action to stop his fraudulent schemes and protect the innocent investors who trusted Pinnacle with their financial futures. How long does the investigation typically take? It varies, depending on the complexity of the case and level of cooperation from the target company. Based on what you've provided, I'd expect this to move relatively quickly. Securities fraud cases involving elderly victims receive priority attention. As I left the SEC office that afternoon, I felt a sense of vindication that had been building for months. Trevor Blackwood had thought he could destroy my career without consequences, that eliminating an older employee would remove any threat to his corrupt empire. He had been catastrophically wrong. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Within 2 weeks, federal agents executed search warrants at Pinnacle's offices, seizing computers, files, and financial records. Local news stations covered the dramatic scene of FBI agents carrying boxes of evidence from the building where I'd worked for nearly 3 decades. Patricia called me that evening, her voice shaking with excitement and relief. "Marcus, you should have seen Trevor's face when the agents walked into his office. He went completely white, like he'd seen a ghost. Security escorted him out in handcuffs an hour later." Trevor's arrest was just the beginning. The investigation revealed a conspiracy that extended beyond his individual actions to include several other executives who'd knowingly participated in defrauding clients. CEO Richard Steinberg was arrested 2 days later, along with Chief Financial Officer David Marcus and Head of Compliance Lisa Park. The local media coverage was extensive, with headlines like "Pinnacle Financial Executives Arrested in Major Securities Fraud Case" and "Whistleblower Exposes Systematic Fraud at Boston Investment Firm." My name wasn't mentioned in the initial reports, but the financial industry is small enough that word spread quickly about who had provided the evidence that brought down Trevor's operation. The vindication felt sweet, but it was tempered by genuine sadness about what had happened to Pinnacle Financial. The company had once been a respected institution that genuinely served its clients' interests. Trevor's corruption had not only harmed individual investors, but destroyed the reputation of an organization that had provided honest financial services for decades. More than 100 clients had lost substantial money due to unsuitable investments, with total damages exceeding $12 million. While some of these losses might be recoverable through insurance and legal action, many elderly investors like Maria Rodriguez would never fully recoup their retirement savings. 6 months after submitting my whistleblower complaint, I received notification that the SEC had reached a settlement agreement with Pinnacle Financial. The company agreed to pay $15 million in fines and restitution, with individual executives facing additional criminal charges that could result in substantial prison sentences. Under the SEC's whistleblower program, I was entitled to receive between 10 and 30% of the monetary sanctions collected. My award totaled $2.8 million, recognition for providing evidence that enabled federal investigators to stop ongoing fraud and recover money for harmed investors. The financial reward was gratifying, but the real satisfaction came from knowing that Trevor Blackwood would never again be in a position to exploit vulnerable investors. He ultimately pleaded guilty to securities fraud and was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, followed by lifetime prohibition from working in the financial industry. The day of Trevor Blackwood's sentencing, I sat in the federal courthouse watching justice finally being served. He looked smaller and older than I remembered, his arrogant confidence replaced by the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone whose world had completely collapsed. When given the opportunity to address the court, Trevor offered what sounded like a prepared statement about accepting responsibility for his actions and expressing remorse for the harm he'd caused. But his words felt empty, lacking the genuine understanding that might indicate actual reformation. As I walked out of the courthouse that afternoon, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me from unemployment and desperation to financial security and vindication. Trevor had fired me because he considered my ethical standards an obstacle to maximizing profits. In the end, those same ethical standards had not only protected innocent investors, but provided me with resources to rebuild my life on my own terms. The irony was perfect. Trevor had tried to dispose of me like outdated equipment, assuming that my age and old-fashioned values made me powerless against his modern approach to wealth extraction. Instead, my experience, integrity, and careful documentation had made me the perfect instrument of his downfall. I used part of my Whistleblower award to establish a scholarship fund in Ilana's memory, providing financial assistance to students pursuing careers in ethical financial planning. The rest allowed me to retire comfortably, secure in the knowledge that I'd never again need to compromise my principles for economic survival. Sometimes justice takes time, but when it finally arrives, it can be more thorough and satisfying than immediate revenge. Trevor Blackwood learned that destroying someone's career doesn't eliminate the threat they represent if they possess the evidence, patience, and determination to see justice served. In the end, the old man he had dismissed as obsolete had proven far more dangerous than the young hotshot he had imagined himself to be. Some lessons come at a price that make them unforgettable, and Trevor's education in the consequences of underestimating others had cost him everything he thought he had built. 3 years have passed since Trevor Blackwood's conviction, and my life has settled into a rhythm I never expected to experience.
The irony of my situation isn't lost on me. At 61, I'm more financially secure than I've ever been, free from the corporate politics and ethical compromises that defined my working years. Yet some mornings I wake up feeling like a man without purpose, wondering if vindication was worth the cost of watching an institution I'd helped build crumble under the weight of corruption. The scholarship fund I established in Elena's memory has grown beyond my initial expectations. Each semester, we award grants to 12 students pursuing degrees in financial planning, with mandatory coursework in ethics and fiduciary responsibility. Last month, I attended the graduation ceremony for our third class of recipients, watching young people enter the industry with values that might prevent another Trevor Blackwood from gaining a foothold. Sarah Martinez, one of our first scholarship recipients, approached me after the ceremony with news that filled me with something approaching paternal pride. She'd been hired by Commonwealth Financial Advisors, a Boston firm known for its conservative approach and client-first philosophy. More importantly, she'd already identified and reported a colleague who was pushing unsuitable annuity products to elderly clients. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice carrying the same conviction I'd once felt, "I want you to know that everything you went through at Pinnacle makes what I'm doing possible. When I see something wrong, I think about your courage in speaking up, and it gives me strength to do the same." Courage. I'd never thought of my actions in those terms. Desperation, perhaps. Anger, certainly. But courage suggested a noble choice between right and wrong, when the reality felt more like having no choice at all. Trevor had backed me into a corner where staying silent would have made me complicit in ongoing fraud. The ripple effects of Pinnacle's collapse continued to unfold in ways I never anticipated. The building where I'd worked for 28 years now houses a pediatric medical practice. Patricia Hoffman, who provided crucial evidence during the investigation, used her settlement money to open an independent financial planning practice focused exclusively on teachers and public employees. She calls it Integrity Financial Services, a name that would have seemed redundant in the industry I'd entered 4 decades ago. Not all the outcomes have been positive. Some of my former colleagues, honest people who'd simply been trying to survive in a toxic environment, struggled to find new employment after Pinnacle's closure. The financial industry has a long memory for scandal, and association with a firm convicted of securities fraud creates permanent stains on professional reputations. Michael Torres, a junior analyst who'd been with the company for only 6 months when the investigation began, contacted me last year seeking a recommendation letter. Despite having no involvement in Trevor's schemes, he'd been unemployed for 18 months because potential employers viewed his Pinnacle experience as a liability. "Mr. Chen," he said during our coffee meeting, "I know you don't owe me anything, but I'm desperate.
My wife is pregnant with our first child, and I can't even get interviews because of the association with what happened there. I wrote the strongest recommendation letter possible, emphasizing his complete innocence and professional competence. 2 weeks later, he called to thank me for helping him secure a position with a small wealth management firm in Providence. The gratitude in his voice reminded me that my actions had consequences beyond Trevor's conviction and my own vindication. These days, I spend most of my time reading, volunteering at the local library's financial literacy program, and maintaining Elena's garden behind our old apartment. The roses she planted still bloom each spring, their persistence serving as a daily reminder that beautiful things can survive even when their creators are gone. The garden has become my sanctuary, a place where I can think, without the distractions of news coverage about financial scandals or updates from former colleagues navigating careers damaged by their association with Pinnacle. Working with soil and plants provides a different kind of satisfaction than managing investment portfolios, more immediate and honest in its rewards. Last Tuesday, while pruning Elena's favorite climbing rose, I heard my phone ringing from inside the apartment. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, with a Washington, D.C. area code that immediately raised my suspicions. Government agencies, law firms, and financial institutions still contacted me occasionally, seeking information about the Pinnacle case or requesting my participation in industry reform initiatives. Mr. Chen, this is Special Agent Rebecca Morrison with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. I'm calling because we have a situation that might benefit from your expertise and experience. My first instinct was to decline whatever involvement they were proposing. The emotional toll of the Pinnacle investigation had been substantial, and I'd promised myself that I was finished with whistleblowing and corporate fraud cases. But something in Agent Morrison's tone suggested this wasn't a routine consultation request. What kind of situation, Agent Morrison? I can't discuss details over the phone, but it involves systematic fraud at multiple financial institutions across New England. The patterns are similar to what you exposed at Pinnacle, but the scope is much larger. We believe you might recognize some of the methodologies being used. The possibility that Trevor's fraudulent techniques had spread to other firms hadn't occurred to me, but it made perfect sense. Financial industry professionals change jobs frequently, carrying their knowledge and contacts to new employers. If some of Trevor's former colleagues or protégés had avoided prosecution, they might have continued implementing his schemes at other companies. Agent Morrison, this looks like a network rather than isolated incidents. Are these firms connected in some way? Agent Kim joined our conversation, carrying a thick folder labeled Personnel Connections.
Inside were organizational charts showing the movement of key personnel between the firms under investigation, with highlighted paths that told a disturbing story. Every firm involved in this scheme has hired at least one former Pinnacle employee in the past 2 years. We believe Trevor Blackwood's former colleagues have been spreading his fraudulent techniques to new employers, essentially franchising his approach to securities fraud. The implications were staggering. Rather than serving as a cautionary tool that deterred others from similar behavior, Pinnacle's collapse had apparently created a diaspora of trained fraudsters who'd learned to refine and systematize Trevor's methods. Who's coordinating this network? There has to be someone providing guidance and training to make the schemes this consistent across multiple firms. Agent Morrison smiled grimly. That's where this gets really interesting. We believe the coordination is coming from someone who was never prosecuted in the original Pinnacle case, someone who understood Trevor's methods well enough to improve them and teach them to others. She handed me a surveillance photograph taken outside a restaurant in downtown Hartford. The image showed 2 men in business suits sharing what appeared to be a private conversation over lunch. I recognized one of them immediately, though he looked older and more polished than I remembered. Jeremy Walsh. He was Trevor's deputy at Pinnacle, the guy who implemented most of the day-to-day fraud operations. I always wondered why he wasn't charged along with the others. Walsh cooperated with federal prosecutors in exchange for immunity from prosecution, Apparently, he's been using that freedom to establish what we're calling a fraud consulting operation, teaching Trevor's techniques to financial advisors at firms across the region. The photograph of Jeremy Walsh triggered memories I'd tried to forget. He'd been Trevor's most loyal supporter, a smooth-talking operator who'd excelled at convincing clients to accept investment strategies that served the company's interests rather than their own. During my final months at Pinnacle, Jeremy had been instrumental in marginalizing my influence and creating the hostile environment that preceded my termination. "What exactly do you need from me, Agent Morrison? It sounds like you already understand what these people are doing." "We need someone who can testify about the original Pinnacle schemes and explain how these new operations represent an evolution of Trevor's methods. More importantly, we need someone who can help us identify which specific techniques are being used at each firm, so we can build stronger cases against the individual perpetrators." The prospect of diving back into financial fraud investigations filled me with conflicting emotions. Part of me felt obligated to help protect new victims from schemes I'd originally exposed, but another part questioned whether I had the energy or emotional resilience to endure another lengthy investigation and potential trial testimony. "Can I take some time to consider your request? This is a significant commitment, and I need to think about whether I'm ready to get involved in another major case." "Of course, but Mr. Chen, I want you to understand the scope of what we're dealing with. Jeremy Walsh's operation has been active for over a year, and we estimate that hundreds of clients have been defrauded using techniques directly derived from your original investigation. In some ways, your success in exposing Pinnacle has been turned against the very people you were trying to protect." That evening, I sat in my garden with Elena's photograph, seeking guidance from someone who'd always provided clarity during moments of difficult decision-making. The roses she'd planted surrounded me with familiar fragrance, creating an atmosphere of peace that contrasted sharply with the turmoil I felt about the FBI's request. "What would you tell me to do, sweetheart?" I asked her picture, knowing that Elena would have had strong opinions about my dilemma. Elena had always believed that people with the ability to help others had an obligation to act, even when action required personal sacrifice. During her final months battling cancer, she'd insisted on continuing her volunteer work at the homeless shelter despite her weakening condition, arguing that her own suffering didn't excuse her from serving people who needed assistance. "You'd tell me to help them, wouldn't you?" I continued my one-sided conversation. "You'd remind me that running away from difficult responsibilities doesn't make them disappear. It just makes them someone else's problem." But Elena had also been fiercely protective of my well-being, particularly during the stressful final years of my career when corporate politics and ethical compromises had begun taking a toll on my health and happiness. She might have counseled caution, suggesting that I'd already done my part by exposing the original Pinnacle fraud. The next morning, I called Agent Morrison and agreed to review their evidence with the understanding that my involvement would be limited to analysis and consultation rather than active investigation. I wasn't ready to become a full-time fraud fighter, but I couldn't ignore the possibility that my knowledge might prevent additional people from losing their retirement savings. The FBI's evidence was comprehensive and damning. Jeremy Walsh had indeed created a sophisticated training program that taught financial advisors how to implement modified versions of Trevor's fraudulent techniques while avoiding the mistakes that had led to Pinnacle's downfall. Walsh's operation included detailed instruction manuals, sample documents for forging client authorizations, and even role-playing exercises that helped advisors practice the deceptive sales techniques needed to convince clients to accept unsuitable investments. Most disturbing was a pricing structure showing Walsh charging firms between $50,000 and $100,000 for complete fraud implementation packages. "This is incredibly sophisticated," I told Agent Morrison during my second visit to their offices. "Walsh has essentially industrialized securities fraud, creating a turnkey system that allows relatively inexperienced advisors to defraud clients with minimal risk of detection." The evidence included recorded phone calls between Walsh and his clients, conversations that demonstrated his cynical understanding of regulatory weaknesses and law enforcement limitations.
In one particularly revealing recording, Walsh explained to a prospective client how the original Pinnacle investigation had taught him to avoid the documentation mistakes that led to Trevor's conviction. The key is maintaining plausible deniability. You need enough legitimate transactions to create cover for the fraudulent ones, and you never put anything in writing that explicitly acknowledges what you're really doing. Agent Kim paused the recording and looked at me with grim satisfaction. We've been investigating Walsh for 8 months, and this is the first time we've captured him explicitly acknowledging that his advice is designed to facilitate fraud. Your insights about the original Pinnacle methods helped us understand what questions to ask and which conversations to focus on. Over the following weeks, I spent increasing amounts of time at the FBI offices reviewing evidence and helping agents understand the technical aspects of the fraud schemes they were investigating. The work was intellectually engaging but emotionally draining, forcing me to relive memories of my own experience while confronting the reality that my original whistleblowing had inadvertently created new opportunities for sophisticated criminals. The most difficult aspect of the investigation was meeting with victims of the new fraud schemes. These were people who'd trusted financial advisors at firms with solid reputations, individuals who'd believed they were making conservative investment decisions to protect their retirement security. Robert and Linda Kowalski, a retired couple from Springfield, had lost 60% of their savings when their advisor invested their money in currency derivatives without proper authorization. Their story was heartbreakingly familiar. Forged risk assessment documents, unsuitable investment recommendations, and a trail of paperwork designed to create the appearance of client consent for transactions they'd never approved. "We thought we were being careful," Linda explained during our meeting at the FBI offices. "We specifically told our advisor that we couldn't afford to lose money, that we needed safe investments for our retirement.
Now we might have to sell our house because we can't afford the mortgage payments." Robert's anger was more direct. "How is this possible? We went to a licensed financial advisor at a reputable firm. Aren't there laws to protect people like us from this kind of theft?" The laws existed, but enforcement was reactive rather than preventative. Regulatory agencies could investigate and prosecute fraud after it occurred, but they couldn't prevent sophisticated criminals from finding new ways to exploit trusting clients. Jeremy Walsh's operation succeeded precisely because it had learned from Trevor Blackwood's mistakes and developed more subtle approaches to the same fundamental crime. My involvement in the investigation expanded gradually, from document review to victim interviews to strategy sessions with prosecutors preparing their cases. Agent Morrison and her team valued my insights not just about fraud techniques, but about the psychology of victims and perpetrators in these schemes. "Mr. Chen," she said during one of our weekly briefings, "your understanding of how these fraudsters think has been invaluable. You're able to predict their behavior patterns in ways that help us anticipate their next moves." This psychological insight stemmed from my unfortunate, intimate knowledge of people like Trevor and Jeremy. I'd worked alongside them for months, observed their decision-making processes, and understood the combination of greed, arrogance, and rationalization that enabled them to justify stealing from vulnerable clients. The federal investigation culminated in a coordinated operation that federal agents called Operation Clean Sweep. On a rainy Thursday morning in November, FBI agents simultaneously executed search warrants at 12 financial firms across 3 states, seizing computers, files, and financial records that documented systematic fraud affecting over 300 clients. Jeremy Walsh was arrested at his home in Westport, Connecticut, where agents discovered a home office filled with fraud training materials, client lists, and records showing payments from financial firms seeking his consulting services. The evidence suggested that his operation had generated over $2 million in revenue while facilitating fraudulent schemes that stole over $38 million from unsuspecting investors. Local news coverage of the arrests was extensive, with reporters drawing explicit connections between the new fraud network and the original Pinnacle financial scandal. My name appeared in several articles as the whistleblower whose original complaint had exposed the techniques now being used across multiple firms.
The media attention was unwelcome, but not unexpected. Financial fraud cases involving elderly victims always attracted significant coverage, and the connection to a previous high-profile scandal made this story particularly newsworthy. I declined all interview requests, preferring to let prosecutors and FBI agents serve as public spokespeople for the investigation. Patricia Hoffman called me the evening after Jeremy Walsh's arrest, her voice filled with satisfaction and relief. "Marcus, I can't believe Jeremy was stupid enough to think he could get away with this. After everything that happened at Pinnacle, how did he imagine that law enforcement wouldn't eventually notice what he was doing?" "Arrogance," I replied simply. "He probably convinced himself that he was smarter than Trevor, that he could avoid the mistakes that led to our original investigation. Criminals always think they're cleverer than the people trying to catch them." The conversation with Patricia reminded me of how much my life had changed since the original Pinnacle investigation. 3 years ago, I'd been a desperate, unemployed man seeking vindication for my destroyed career. Now, I was a respected expert whose insights were valued by federal law enforcement agencies investigating complex financial crimes. But expertise came with responsibility. Agent Morrison had made it clear that my involvement in the Jeremy Walsh investigation was unlikely to be my last consultation with federal authorities. The techniques I'd learned to identify and document were apparently becoming more common as unscrupulous financial professionals sought new ways to exploit client trust. "Mr. Chen," she'd said during our final debriefing session, "I hope you'll consider making yourself available for future cases. Your knowledge of these fraud patterns is unique, and there are probably other Jeremy Walsh operations we haven't discovered yet." The prospect of becoming a career consultant on financial fraud cases was both appealing and daunting. The work was meaningful and intellectually stimulating, but it also required emotional engagement with stories of financial devastation that reminded me daily of human beings' capacity for cruelty toward vulnerable people. 6 months after Jeremy Walsh's conviction and sentencing to 12 years in federal prison, I received another call from Agent Morrison. This time, she was investigating potential fraud at a series of investment firms in Florida that apparently hired former associates of both Trevor Blackwood and Jeremy Walsh. "Mr. Chen, we're seeing the same patterns again, but with even more sophisticated techniques for avoiding detection. These people are learning from each investigation and developing more subtle approaches to the same fundamental crimes." This call forced me to confront an uncomfortable reality. My original decision to expose Trevor Blackwood's fraud had been motivated by a desire to protect innocent investors and achieve justice for the wrongs committed against me. But the unintended consequence had been to create a learning laboratory for other criminals who studied successful prosecution strategies and developed improved methods for avoiding detection. I was trapped in an endless cycle of investigation and prosecution, each case teaching new lessons to the next generation of financial predators. Jeremy Walsh had learned from Trevor's mistakes, and now Jeremy's former associates were learning from his mistakes, creating an evolutionary process that produced increasingly sophisticated fraud schemes. "Mr. Chen, I appreciate the confidence you have in my abilities, but I need to ask you honestly, are these investigations actually making a difference? Every time we shut down one operation, 2 more seem to appear with improved techniques." Her response was thoughtful and honest. "Mr. Chen, I can't promise you that we're winning this war, but I can tell you that every case we solve protects specific victims and sends a message to potential perpetrators. The Jeremy Walsh investigation alone recovered $8 million for defrauded clients and prevented additional losses that could have reached $20 million. Those numbers represented real people with real families who had avoided financial devastation because of our work. Robert and Linda Kowalski had recovered most of their stolen savings. Sarah Martinez's vigilance at her new firm had been directly influenced by the scholarship program I'd established. The ripple effects of fighting fraud extended far beyond individual prosecutions. That evening, I sat in Alana's garden with her photograph, surrounded by roses that had survived another New England winter to bloom again in spring. The persistence of beautiful things in the face of harsh conditions seemed like a metaphor
for the ongoing struggle against financial fraud. "You'd tell me to keep fighting, wouldn't you, sweetheart?" I said to her picture. "You'd remind me that helping people is never futile, even when the problems seem overwhelming." Elena had never been naive about the world's capacity for injustice, but she'd maintained an unshakable belief that individual actions could create meaningful change. Her volunteer work at the homeless shelter hadn't solved homelessness, but it had provided shelter and hope to specific people who needed assistance. Perhaps my work fighting financial fraud served a similar purpose.
The next morning, I called Agent Morrison and agreed to review the evidence from her Florida investigation. The cycle would continue, but with Elena's memory as my guide, I felt prepared to face whatever sophisticated fraud schemes awaited my analysis. Some battles are worth fighting not because victory is guaranteed, but because the alternative is surrendering the field to people who prey on trust and vulnerability. Trevor Blackwood had taught me that lesson when he destroyed my career, and Jeremy Walsh had reinforced it when he turned my original investigation into a criminal education program. Now, at 61, I finally understood my purpose in this new phase of life. I wasn't just a retired teacher or a successful whistleblower. I was a guardian of financial integrity, someone whose experience and knowledge could protect innocent people from sophisticated predators who viewed their trust as an opportunity for exploitation. The roses Elena had planted continued to bloom each spring, their beauty persisting despite winter's harsh conditions. Like those roses, the fight for financial justice would continue, season after season, case after case, until criminals learned that some people refused to be silenced or intimidated. Jeremy Walsh had made the same mistake as Trevor Blackwood, assuming that defeating one opponent would eliminate the threat they represented. Instead, each victory had taught me new lessons about fraud detection and created new connections with law enforcement agencies committed to protecting vulnerable investors. The old man they'd tried to discard had become something far more dangerous than they'd imagined, an expert witness with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Some education comes at a price that makes it unforgettable, and the criminals who'd underestimated me were still learning that lesson in federal prison. The Florida investigation led to the largest financial fraud prosecution in federal court history, with 47 defendants across 11 states facing charges that could result in sentences totaling over 300 years. But for me, the real victory came on a warm Tuesday morning in April, when I received a call that changed everything about how I understood the impact of standing up to corruption. "Mr. Chen, this is Detective Maria Santos with the Boston Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. I'm calling because we've identified a pattern of elder abuse cases that we believe are connected to techniques you helped expose in the federal investigations." Elder abuse. The phrase carried implications that went far beyond securities fraud. While federal prosecutors focused on violations of investment regulations, local law enforcement was discovering that the techniques used to defraud elderly investors were being adapted for broader criminal purposes by people who'd learned that seniors made vulnerable targets. What kind of elder abuse, Detective Santos? Identity theft, credit card fraud, home equity scams, and something we're calling financial kidnapping, where criminals gain control of elderly people's bank accounts and systematically drain their assets. The methods are sophisticated, but they follow patterns that match the investment fraud cases you've been working on. The connection made disturbing sense. Criminals who'd mastered the psychology of convincing elderly people to make bad financial decisions could easily adapt those skills to more direct theft. The trust-building techniques, the pressure tactics, and the documentation fraud were transferable across different types of crimes. Detective Santos, how can I help with your investigation? We'd like you to review some case files and help us understand whether these local crimes are connected to the larger fraud networks you've been tracking. If they are, we might be able to coordinate with federal authorities to build stronger cases against the organizations behind all of this. 3 days later, I sat in a cramped detective bureau in downtown Boston, surrounded by case files that painted a horrifying picture of systematic elder abuse. The victims ranged from retired teachers and factory workers to former business owners and healthcare professionals, all people who'd worked hard their entire lives only to have their savings stolen by criminals who'd perfected the art of exploiting trust. Agnes Murphy, an 83-year-old widow from Dorchester, had lost her house after someone convinced her to sign documents she believed were for a reverse mortgage, but were actually a property transfer to a shell company. The paperwork looked legitimate, complete with notary seals and legal language that disguised its true purpose. Thomas Benedetto, a 79-year-old retired postal worker, had his identity stolen after providing personal information to someone claiming to represent his bank's fraud prevention department. The caller had known enough specific details about his accounts to sound legitimate, information that could only have come from insider sources. Detective Santos, these cases show a level of coordination and inside information that suggests organized criminal activity. This isn't random, opportunistic crime. Someone is recruiting and training people to target elderly victims using intelligence gathered from financial institutions. She nodded grimly. That's exactly what we suspected, but we needed someone with your background to confirm it. The techniques are too sophisticated and consistent to be coincidental. As I reviewed more case files, a pattern emerged that connected the local elder abuse crimes to the investment fraud networks I'd been tracking. Several victims had initially been approached by people claiming to be financial advisors or insurance salespeople, individuals who used legitimate-sounding credentials to gain access to personal information that was later used for identity theft and bank fraud. The criminal organization had essentially created a pipeline that began with investment fraud and expanded into comprehensive financial exploitation. Elderly people who refused unsuitable investment recommendations became targets for more aggressive theft tactics, while those who accepted fraudulent investments were gradually stripped of all their remaining assets through subsequent scams. This is incredibly sophisticated, I told Detective Santos. They're not just committing individual crimes, they're operating a systematic wealth extraction operation that uses multiple techniques to completely drain elderly people's financial resources. The scope of the operation became clear as we cross-referenced victims from the investment fraud cases with victims of the elder abuse crimes. Nearly 40% of the people who'd been defrauded by Jeremy Walsh's network had subsequently been targeted by identity thieves, home equity scammers, or other financial predators. Margaret Sinclair, one of Jeremy Walsh's original victims, had lost $30,000 to unsuitable cryptocurrency investments. 6 months later, someone claiming to represent a home security company convinced her to provide personal information that was used to open credit cards in her name. By the time she discovered the identity theft, criminals had run up over $50,000 in fraudulent charges. They're treating elderly people like renewable resources, I explained to Detective Santos. Once they identify someone as vulnerable and trusting, they pass that information to other criminals who use different techniques to steal whatever assets remain.
The key is making them feel special, one trainer explained in a recording that made my stomach turn. Elderly people are often lonely and isolated. If you can make them feel like you genuinely care about their well-being, they'll trust you with information they'd never give to strangers. Another recording detailed techniques for pressuring elderly victims to make quick decisions before they could consult family members or other advisors. Create urgency, the trainer instructed. Tell them the opportunity is limited, that they need to act immediately to protect themselves or take advantage of special offers. Never give them time to think or ask questions. The criminal psychology was sophisticated and deliberately cruel. These weren't desperate people committing crimes of opportunity. They were organized predators who'd studied the vulnerabilities of elderly Americans and developed systematic methods for exploiting those vulnerabilities for maximum financial gain. My role in the investigation evolved from document analysis to victim advocacy. Law enforcement agencies needed someone who could explain to elderly victims how they'd been targeted and help them understand the coordinated nature of the crimes committed against them. Many victims blame themselves for falling prey to sophisticated scams, feeling ashamed and embarrassed about being deceived. "Mrs. Sinclair," I said during one particularly difficult victim interview, "you need to understand that you weren't targeted randomly. These criminals spent months learning about your financial situation, your personal history, and your psychological vulnerabilities. They used that information to craft approaches specifically designed to overcome your natural caution." Margaret Sinclair, now 81 and living in a subsidized apartment after losing her home to equity fraud, looked at me with tears in her eyes. "But I should have known better. I should have seen through their lies. These criminals are professionals who spend their entire careers perfecting techniques for deceiving people. Blaming yourself for being victimized by experts is like blaming yourself for losing a chess game to a grandmaster. You were deliberately targeted because you fit their profile of someone who could be successfully exploited." The victim interviews were emotionally exhausting but necessary for building strong legal cases against the criminal organization. Each story added another piece to the puzzle of how the enterprise operated and identified new targets for investigation. The coordinated law enforcement response culminated in Operation Golden Shield, simultaneous raids on criminal facilities in 8 states that resulted in 73 arrests and the seizure of assets worth over $12 million. The investigation revealed that the criminal organization had stolen an estimated $45 million from elderly victims over a 3-year period. Jeremy Walsh, already serving his federal sentence for securities fraud, was indicted on additional charges related to his role in establishing the elder abuse network. Federal prosecutors were seeking an additional 25 years in prison, which would effectively guarantee that he'd spend the rest of his life incarcerated. The arrests made national news, with stories focusing on the vulnerability of elderly Americans to increasingly sophisticated financial crimes. My name appeared in several articles as the whistleblower whose original complaint had eventually led to exposing the broader criminal enterprise, though I continued declining interview requests. The media attention had an unexpected consequence. I began receiving calls from elderly people across the country who'd been victimized by financial crimes and were seeking advice about reporting their experiences to law enforcement. Many had been too embarrassed or confused to seek help, assuming that they'd simply made poor financial decisions rather than been deliberately defrauded. Anna Chen, no relation despite sharing my surname, called from Sacramento with a story that perfectly illustrated how the criminal organization operated. She'd been approached by someone claiming to represent a financial planning service for Chinese-American retirees, a person who spoke Mandarin and demonstrated detailed knowledge of her cultural background and financial concerns. "Mr. Chen, this man seemed so knowledgeable and respectful. He understood my worries about leaving money for my children and grandchildren. I trusted him because he seemed to share my values and understand my situation." The approach was carefully crafted to exploit cultural trust and specific community concerns. Anna had lost $60,000 to fraudulent investments before discovering that the financial planner was actually part of the criminal organization that targeted elderly immigrants by exploiting their cultural backgrounds and community connections. These criminals research their targets extensively. They learn about your background, your values, and your concerns so they can present themselves as trustworthy members of your community. The fact that you were deceived doesn't reflect poor judgment on your part. It reflects their sophisticated understanding of human psychology. Stories like Anna's convinced me that my work fighting financial elder abuse needed to expand beyond assisting law enforcement investigations. Elderly Americans needed education about the sophisticated techniques being used to target them, and they needed advocates who could help them navigate the complex process of reporting crimes and recovering assets. With encouragement from Agent Morrison and Detective Santos, I established the Chen Foundation for Elder Financial Protection, a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating seniors about financial crimes and providing support services for victims of elder abuse. The foundation used part of my SEC Whistleblower Awards to fund programs that had been desperately needed but unavailable through government agencies. Our first initiative was a series of educational seminars at senior centers, community centers, and retirement communities across Massachusetts. The presentations focused on real-world examples of financial crimes, warning signs that elderly people should recognize, and practical steps for protecting personal information and assets. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of elderly people attended our seminars, many sharing stories of suspicious approaches they'd received or financial losses they'd suffered but never reported. The presentations created a forum for victims to realize they weren't alone and for potential targets to learn protective strategies. "Mr. Chen," said Robert Kowalski during one of our seminars in Springfield, "your presentation helped me understand that what happened to Linda and me wasn't our fault. We thought we'd been stupid for trusting our financial advisor, but now we realize we were deliberately targeted by criminals." The educational work was personally rewarding, but also revealed the massive scope of unreported elder financial abuse. For every case that came to law enforcement attention, dozens more remained hidden because victims were too embarrassed to seek help or didn't understand that they'd been deliberately targeted by criminals. Our foundation's victim support services included assistance with reporting crimes to appropriate agencies, help navigating the asset recovery process, and emotional support for elderly people struggling with the psychological impact of being victimized. We partnered with local legal aid organizations to provide pro bono legal representation for victims seeking to recover stolen assets. The work brought me full circle from my original experience as a victim of workplace fraud to becoming an advocate for other victims of financial crimes. The skills I'd developed documenting securities fraud translated directly to helping elderly people understand how they'd been targeted and empowering them to fight back against their victimizers. 2 years after establishing the foundation, we'd assisted over 300 elder crime victims, recovered more than $2 million in stolen assets, and provided education to thousands of seniors about financial crime prevention. The success attracted attention from federal agencies seeking to expand their elder protection efforts. "Mr. Chen," Agent Morrison said during one of our regular coordination meetings, "the work your foundation is doing has become a model for other communities dealing with elder financial abuse. We're getting requests from law enforcement agencies across the country asking for guidance on replicating your programs."
The recognition was gratifying, but it also highlighted the massive scope of the problem we were trying to address. Financial elder abuse was epidemic across America, with criminals stealing an estimated $36 billion annually from elderly victims. Our foundation's work, while meaningful, represented a small fraction of what was needed to adequately protect vulnerable seniors. On a sunny morning in September, exactly 7 years after Trevor Blackwood had fired me from Pinnacle Financial, I stood before a congressional subcommittee to testify about elder financial abuse and the need for stronger federal protections. The hearing room was packed with family members of elderly crime victims, advocates for senior citizens, and law enforcement officials seeking legislative support for enhanced enforcement tools. "Mr. Chairman," I began my prepared testimony, 7 years ago, I was fired from my job for refusing to participate in securities fraud. That experience taught me that speaking up against financial crimes isn't just about protecting individual victims. It's about defending the fundamental trust that makes our financial system function. The testimony detailed the evolution from Trevor's original investment fraud to the sophisticated elder abuse networks that had grown from those techniques. I explained how criminals had learned to exploit regulatory gaps and enforcement limitations, creating systematic approaches to financial elder abuse that generated billions in illegal profits. The criminals we're fighting aren't opportunistic individuals committing random crimes, I explained to the subcommittee. They're organized enterprises that recruit and train professional fraudsters to target elderly Americans using sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques. Fighting them requires coordinated federal response and enhanced penalties that match the severity of their crimes.
The congressional hearing resulted in bipartisan legislation that strengthened federal penalties for elder financial abuse and provided additional funding for law enforcement agencies investigating these crimes. The Elder Financial Protection Act included provisions I'd specifically recommended, such as mandatory reporting requirements for financial institutions and enhanced whistleblower protections for people reporting elder abuse. 6 months later, I received a call that brought my journey full circle in the most satisfying way possible. Jennifer Chang, the SEC investigator who'd handled my original Pinnacle complaint, was calling with news about Trevor Blackwood's latest legal troubles. "Mr. Chen, I thought you'd want to know that Trevor's been indicted on additional federal charges related to his role in establishing the criminal networks we've been investigating. The new charges carry a potential life sentence, meaning he'll never be released from federal prison. Trevor apparently continued coordinating criminal activities from his prison cell, using contraband cell phones to maintain contact with former associates and provide guidance for new fraud schemes. Federal prosecutors were treating him as the leader of a continuing criminal enterprise, a designation that carried the harshest penalties available under federal law. He never learned the lesson, did he?" I asked Jennifer. "Even after being convicted and imprisoned, he continued believing that he was smarter than everyone else and could keep committing crimes without consequences." "Some people never learn," she agreed. "But Mr. Chen, I want you to know that your original complaint about Pinnacle has ultimately led to prosecutions that have protected thousands of elderly Americans and recovered hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen assets. Your decision to speak up has had consequences far beyond what you imagined when you first walked into our office." The phone call prompted reflection on the unexpected journey that had begun with my termination from Pinnacle Financial. What started as a desperate attempt to achieve justice for my destroyed career had evolved into a comprehensive campaign against elder financial abuse that had changed federal law and protected countless vulnerable Americans. Elena's photograph still smiled at me from the mantel each morning, her presence a constant reminder of the values that had guided my decisions throughout this ordeal. She'd always believed that people with the ability to help others had an obligation to act, regardless of personal cost or convenience. "We did it, sweetheart," I said to her picture, on the morning after Trevor's new indictment was announced. "We protected people who couldn't protect themselves, and we made sure the criminals who hurt them faced real consequences." The roses she'd planted in the garden behind our apartment continued blooming in the garden behind our apartment, their persistence through harsh New England winters serving as a metaphor for the ongoing fight against financial predators. Some battles required sustained effort across multiple seasons, but the results justified the investment when innocent people were protected from sophisticated criminals. At 64, I'd found a purpose I never expected, but one that utilized every skill I'd developed during my career in financial services. The analytical abilities that had made me effective at managing investment portfolios proved essential for identifying fraud patterns. The teaching experience that had helped me explain complex concepts to students translated perfectly to educating elderly people about financial crime prevention. Most importantly, the ethical standards that had made me incompatible with Trevor Blackwood's corrupt culture had become the foundation for protecting thousands of elderly Americans from financial predators who viewed their trust as nothing more than an opportunity for exploitation. The Chen Foundation for Elder Financial Protection now operates programs in 12 states, with plans to expand nationally over the next 2 years. We've assisted over 1,500 elderly crime victims, recovered more than $12 million in stolen assets, and provided education to tens of thousands of seniors about financial crime prevention. But the statistics, while meaningful, don't capture the real impact of our work. The Foundation's true success is measured in phone calls from elderly people who avoided being victimized because they recognized warning signs we'd taught them to identify. It's measured in families who didn't lose their inheritance to financial predators because their elderly relatives had learned to be appropriately suspicious of unsolicited financial offers. Trevor Blackwood's final conviction and life sentence represents more than justice for individual crimes. It symbolizes the ultimate failure of a worldview that treated elderly people as resources to be exploited rather than human beings deserving protection and respect. His criminal empire, built on the assumption that vulnerable people were acceptable casualties in the pursuit of profit, ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own cruelty. The young executive who'd once dismissed me as an obsolete burden had learned too late that wisdom, experience, and ethical conviction could prove more powerful than arrogance, manipulation, and greed. Some lessons come at a price that make them unforgettable, and Trevor's education in the consequences of underestimating others had cost him everything he thought he wanted. As I sit in Elena's garden on this warm spring evening, surrounded by roses that have survived another winter to bloom again, I feel the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that speaking up against injustice can create changes that extend far beyond immediate circumstances. The decision to expose financial fraud at Pinnacle had protected countless people I'll never meet in ways I never imagined when I first submitted my whistleblower complaint. The old man they'd tried to discard had become something far more dangerous than they'd ever suspected. A protector of the vulnerable, an educator of the targeted, and a relentless advocate for financial justice. Trevor's mistake had been confusing age with obsolescence, experience with irrelevance, and ethical standards with weakness. In the end, the burden he dismissed had proven capable of carrying the weight of protecting an entire vulnerable population from predators who viewed their trust as nothing more than an opportunity for profit. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.